So let's look at the pressing question on everybody's mind, and that's when will real estate prices in Toronto drop? Now, we've had an unprecedented amount of interest rate hikes. They're starting to come down a little bit still, but right now the rates are still really restrictive, and a lot of people are renewing at these high interest rates, and payments are through the roof. Economy is doing not so well. We're pretty much in a recession. People are starting to say that this is the start of the real estate crash. So stay tuned. We'll go through some of the factors addressing the housing market right now and see what potentially could lead to a real estate crash.
Look, I get it. The Toronto real estate market is confusing. Whether you're a new or experienced investor or just looking for a home to raise your family in, join us at Broadview Table Talks as you sit around the table with my friends and talk about the real estate and the ever-changing market in Toronto.
It's Kenneth. I am a real estate broker. I've been doing this for close to 19 years in Toronto. So let's look at the overall housing market in the GTA. For all housing types, I'm not going to single out detached versus semi-detached or condos, at least not yet, because realistically, it's the overall market, and condos relative to the price of detached homes is pretty much the same, really. I mean, the months of inventory and the sales to new listings ratio, which I'll get to in a minute. If we look at the overall data set, like if you single in too much, a lot of people actually like to do that. A lot of realtors like to do that. They look at a specific neighborhood and look at a specific housing type where there's like maybe 30 sales or something like that. That's, to me, not enough information to extrapolate a trend of what's happening. You can't look at 30 or 40 or 50, even 200 sales. Like it's hard to really give you an accurate assessment because one sale could really just, throw that whole thing off. If we're looking at a series of 5,000 sales, that's a little bit more analytics that you'd get overall in general. The overall market in the month of July, last month, because we're in mid-August right now, but the only data that we have is for July, and compare month over month because it takes away the idea of seasonality. In July 2024, we had 5,300 new sales. And if you divide that by the number of new listings at 16,000 for the month of July, then you get a ratio of 33%, which is actually kind of really bad. A balanced market would be 50% sales to new listings. So the theory is that if you have 5,000 sales happening for that month, in theory, you should have 10,000 new listings because 5,000 would replenish those sales, and then we have another remaining 5,000 for next month, assuming that there's 5,000 sales as well. You'd like to have a 2-to-1 ratio of new listings to sales. So right now we're at more than that. We're at 33%, which is kind of really crappy. I mean, yeah, that's 3-to-1. Okay, so let's look at some of the history of when the market was hot. So there's been a few months where the sales to new listings ratio was a 1-to-1. So for every new listing that came on the market, it sold within that month, which is insane. That's a pretty hot market, really. Because there's there's the really nice properties that sell like instantly in like a day or a week or even. But if you're talking about the overall market in general, that's hard because every time there's a new listing and it sells within that month, that means there's no inventory. So of course there's going to be bidding wars. So times where that happened, there's been a few of them where it was over 100%. Well, we're talking about December 98, December 99. Actually, you know what? You can't look at December's sales to new listings ratios because those are kind of out of whack. When you look at December, Christmas time, no one's really listing their homes, right? So yes, there's sales happening, but there's no new listings on the market because everybody's thinking about waiting until January at least, or maybe even the spring. So of course, December sales to new listings ratios are going to be really crazy and out of whack. Let's not look at that. But in the middle of the year, 33%, definitely more of a buyer's market right now. So it's not that sales aren't happening. Sales definitely are happening. It's just that there's a lot more inventory for people to choose from. We like to call it a beauty pageant market where only the winners, beautiful ones, the ones that stand out with good staging, easy showing to access. You don't have to deal with tenants in there. You can book it like pretty much instantly. And it's always going to show perfect every single time, like a model home, like no one ever lives there. Decluttered. Those are the ones that are going to sell, or if it's priced really well. Another metric I like to look at is the months of inventory. And what's that included is that you look at the active listings. So right now it's 23,000 active listings, close to 24,000 in the overall market. And that actually is a record high. Now, the all-time highs are kind of a misnomer because we have an all-time high population. Of course, if there's more people, there's going to be more active listings, if that makes sense, because there's newer homes, more homes are getting built every year, and those homes aren't coming off the market. It's not like we're demolishing them and just getting rid of them. They just don't disappear. Overall, in general, we're going to have more and more inventory as our population grows. Yeah, expect to have an all-time high, but if you even zoom in for the past, 3-4 years, it's still pretty high. Again, if you take that ratio, the active listings divided by the number of sales, in theory, if you have 24,000 active listings and 6,000 sales, then you're looking at about 4 months of inventory. So if all else happens and all else stays the same, pace of sales stays the same, it would take 4 months to blow through that inventory to sell it all. Like I understand some of them will never sell. Some sellers have unrealistic prices. Some properties are just they'll never sell and they'll sit there for years or just come off the market. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about if you look at the number of active listings divided by the number of sales, you get just a theoretical number of how many months it would take to sell that all. So right now we're again at an all-time high of inventory, 4.4 months of inventory. That's a lot. The last time this happened was in October 23. If you remember, we had some rate relief, or we had a rate pause in April and May, I think, of 23. And if you recall, there was an expectation that finally this was kind of like the end of the interest rate hikes, but no, they kept going up. So October was the peak of it, 4.2 months. That was kind of deadly. And if you remember, that market was really slow. And then back in April 2020, we had the same thing, 3.6 months. Back then was when just COVID just started hit, at least in Ontario anyway, in Toronto. I think it really started hitting in March, February really. But then in March is when the sales started to slow down. And then by April, it really was the peak. But then all of a sudden the government introduced 0.25% overnight lending rates and free money everywhere. And the market took off. That's why I could see the months inventory dip well below the trend line. If you take out all the seasonality of it and we look at only, and we zero in on every single July, generally the months of July and August are pretty slow. So next month you're going to see not a ton of sales happening because everybody's thinking about summer vacation. You know, Toronto summers are just awesome and it's just out there. No one's thinking about buying or selling. The kids are off school and you just want to spend time with them. People are at the cottage, they're traveling, they're just not thinking about making a move. If we look at every single July and back everything out, you'll see we're pretty much flat in sales. It's kind of like what you would normally expect for a July. However, the average prices continue to shot up and it hasn't come down. I'll get to why that's happening and my thoughts of it. And the whole purpose of this video is to say, when will prices come down? So let's see if it actually will. But we're looking at the new listings. It's not that bad. 16,000 new listings compared to something like 12,000 on average. And active listings, that's where we have the problem. Things are just sitting there and they're not really selling as much. We're seeing months of inventory climb and continue to mount on. But the average price is not dropping. It's most likely because if you're a homeowner, you'll realize that your house is your sanctuary. It's where you're raising your family. If you don't have a family, it's where you live. It's where you rest. We all need to sleep at the end of the day. To be homeless, it creates so many social problems. And I think a lot of the problems happen from being homeless, right? People in the streets and things like that. I mean, it's unfortunate to see that. If you have your secure home, it's the foundation of starting your life, really. And it's why we work. It's why we go to jobs to pay a mortgage and pay our bills and really start a family. It's like, so you're going to do everything you can to pay your mortgage. And I feel like people have a fear of loss as opposed to missing on gains, really. It's called loss aversion. If you're losing out and you're afraid of losing your home, last thing you're not going to pay is your mortgage. Also, on top of that, you're not going to sell if prices are lower than what you bought for the majority part, unless you really have to, unless you're truly a distressed seller. Like say you bought something and then you really need to sell that asset to get the money back out to move into, upsizing, or maybe you're in a situation where you can't afford the mortgage anymore. So you just have to sell lower than what you bought for. Most people aren't selling at less than what they bought for. That's why it explains the number of sales that are decreasing, right? Like a low number of sales. The problem is investors that have a ton of equity are selling less than what the last guy sold for. With investors, they're generally limited to condos. Like most investors, the mom and pop investors that are just starting out, majority of people anyway, it's so easy to buy a second, third, or fourth property. And generally they're just condos because it's just easy to buy and sell. They're cheaper price points, easy to rent out because they're generally in good areas. But the problem with condos is that they're generally built on a stack. So there's going to be a lot of comparables that are pretty much exact. And if one of them sells at, I'm just going to throw a number there, 500,000, and you want to sell better than what the other guy got, like, of course you're going to want to get what the other guy got. But if there's no buyers out there and nobody's buying because the numbers don't make sense to rent out anymore to cover your costs, your maintenance, and your taxes, then you're looking at undercutting that and selling it for 490, let's just say. So that's just kind of like the race to the bottom. And that's what's happening with average prices for investment condos, just because they're kind of disposable. You're not living in there. If it's an investment, it's not your family there. It's not you in there. It's a tenant. And if it just so happens that the place becomes vacant, you really absolutely need to sell and your tenant agrees with you or things like that, right? Like it doesn't make sense to re-rent it, especially when the mortgage rates are so high right now, or if your mortgage resets. So I find those are the market where there's tons of opportunity. But there's also situations where if you're living in a condo as an end user and you have a new addition to the family, kid or something along the way, and you actually need that third bedroom or second bedroom, or even like you need a yard now, right? You're kind of sick of living in high rise. Then it's kind of hard because a lot of your equity could be built in your condo and you have to liquidate it. But if there's no buyers, what are you going to do? And then there's people that are end users in condos that just aren't selling, so they're not moving to the house, and that totally affects the overall market in general. Again, 4.4 months of inventory is not a great thing, but let's get to the good news. The bull case of why I don't think that there might be a crash in real estate is because interest rates are coming down. I mean, they're not coming down as fast as we want them to. We're in a recession right now. There's definitely jobs being lost. We're seeing unemployment ticking up as well too. If people don't have jobs to pay the mortgages or get qualified for mortgages and banks are getting getting tighter and tighter for the restrictions and lending criteria, the market's overall generally slower. And what usually happens in order to sell it is that prices come down. So as the rates come down, the housing market might eventually pick up. And it's like the $1 million question. At some point, it'll make sense to be an investor again. Obviously, rents are going to go up because less and less people are going to qualify to purchase housing, and more the demand will shift towards rental. And then on top of that, for the past 2 years, because the numbers just didn't make sense for investors, developers weren't building anything because buyers weren't buying. And a lot of the market, the pre-sale market, that's pre-construction condos, right? That was all mainly investors. Because if you're buying for a project from 4 or 5 years out, you're not going to wait for that long if you're an end user. Like, you're not saying not all end users buy pre-construction condos, but the majority of people are investors. They do buy it to rent it out, just to buy themselves that time. But if they're not buying pre-sale prices, then developers aren't developing because banks won't lend to them, because nobody's really developing with all cash, right? Like, you're talking about $500 million, $1 billion to build a project. Like, it's just not happening out of their own cash. It's all leverage at the end of the day. So if we're not building for the past 2 years, what do you think that'll do to supply as we hammer on immigration? We're up to 41 million people in Canada, and 1.5 million people are coming this year alone so far. So we're at a supply shortage, and we have 2 decades of supply shortage. So it's just going to get even worse and worse if we're not building, and people can't afford homes. Rental prices are just going to have no choice but to shoot up. That's why I tell people buy 2 bedrooms, because you have the option of getting roommates. You know, I'm seeing that a lot more now. Like, just the conversation of New York, like 10 years ago, even now, no one even thought about the word of owning your own home or living by yourself. It's always the word of having a roommate. As we see more and more people cram into houses, I think getting more square footage really does make a difference. And I think you should look into that, getting more bedrooms. Again, it's not investment advice. It's different for every situation. But generally, overall, I would rather recommend getting more bedrooms if possible, as many as you can get. And the debate about income tied to affordability. Yes, affordability does matter, but like, I think affordability tied to house prices, that metric was gone a long time ago. Like, at some point, it was 3 times your income was what it took to get a house, right? Like, as long as you make 100 grand, you can afford a place for 300 grand. But that's not the case anymore. It's like pretty much 8 times your income, if not more, to get the typical house. In order to buy something on average, I think the top 1% of the population makes over 200 grand. And it just so happens that if you're buying something for, you know, the average price of 1.13 million, you need 200,000 to qualify for a mortgage. So really the top 1% of earners right now are purchasing, if you're looking at the income tied to affordability. A lot of people are actually buying through wealth from parents that have built up over the years. They're just giving some of their kids some of the deposit money, or people are trading up. And right now that's kind of held at a standstill because the entry level isn't moving, and that just has a whole chain effect of going up the chain. Yes, the overall market is somewhat sluggish, but the number of sales are still relatively kind of flat. There's still a number of sales. We're not down to like 0 sales. We're still at close to 6,000 sales in the overall market. There's nuances in the market, of course. If you have any questions for your specific situation, just click the link below. There is a link to book an appointment on my calendar. Just talk for 15 minutes about your situation and how we could potentially help you. With that, hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll catch you next week.
Add it up.